totally fine. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Laura Brandis, and I'm the Communications Director at the POLIS Water Sustainability Project at the University of Victoria. I'm happy to be welcoming you to today's webinar, and today's session is actually a bit special. It's part of our regular Creating a Blue Dialogue webinar series, which POLIS has been hosting we're actually in our 4th season now. But it's also specifically designed as a bit of a virtual lead-in to a large watershed governance forum that we'll be hosting here on Vancouver Island next week. So I know that most of you, in fact, in the room are going to be delegates at the forum next week. So welcome. However, if any of you in the room are not delegates at the forum, that is totally fine. It's not a requirement, and we welcome you as well. And with our Creating the Blue Dialogue webinar series, the goal is to bring together in one online community water leaders and professionals from a diversity of backgrounds, and we engage in emerging and innovative topics in water policy and governance. And today, David Rapport will be providing a global perspective on freshwater issues, drawing on his background in ecosystem health. He'll be exploring innovative solutions for healthy ecosystems and also for healthy people. Before we get into the presentation, though, I do want to give a thank you to all of our partners and supporters. And in particular, I want to say a thank you to the Canadian Water Network for being the core supporter of this year's series. And you can see all of our other partners and funders on that slide. So before I do hand things over to David, it's important that I run through a few housekeeping items. The first thing is audio. So you will all have noticed that I have a blanket mute on everybody. So what this means is you can't talk. I can talk. So which leads me to the second question, which is how will we deal with the question period? And a number of you are already using the chat box. The way this works is David will give his presentation. At the end, we'll open up the floor to discussion, which is often the most interesting part of these presentations. You can just type your questions in the chat box. I'll serve as the facilitator, reading them out, giving a voice to those questions, and David will be on the line as our one-man panelist. And the reason that we keep everybody muted is simply because of the number of people in the room. It would be too much audio chaos. So I know a number of you are already introducing yourself in the chat box. If you haven't done that, I would invite you to do so. I always like to get a sense of who we have in the room here today so we can really visualize the community that we've brought together. It provides for a much more engaging discussion than if we're all just sort of these anonymous log-in people from across the country. So while you're introducing yourselves, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. And today we are joined by Dr. David Rapport, and he's a pioneer in the field of ecosystem health, and he's also the founder and principal of Ecohealth Consulting. David works as an adjunct professor at Royal Roads University here in Victoria, and also at multiple universities in China. David developed the concept of ecosystem health based on fieldwork in the Great Lakes and the Baltic Sea, which was undertaken in the 1980s. And his current writings focus on the evaluation of the health of large-scale ecosystems, the critical importance of healthy ecosystems, human health and well-being, policy-relevant indicators of the health of ecosystems, and also the role of biocultural diversity in sustaining healthy ecosystems. So with that introduction, it's my pleasure to hand things over to David. So David, if you don't mind pressing *6 on your telephone, that will bring your voice on the line.
Good morning or good day.
Good morning. So I'm going to stop my webcam and David's going to start his so that you can see him while he's presenting. So I'll be back at the end when we open the floor up to questions.
Thank you, Laura. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
All right, fine. And good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to join this seminar and as a prelude to the upcoming workshop. As Laura has mentioned, this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. I've been working on these topics for many decades. And I'm happy to see that this discussion is focusing on the critical issue of governance for healthy watersheds, or for watersheds, I should say. And certainly ecological units are important, and an ecosystem approach to these questions is critical, and which is quite a change from the way things were back 4 or 5 decades ago, when political units were more of the subject of discussions of the environment. And the environment at that time was discussed more in terms of land, water, and air. It still is to some extent, but obviously this is a complex ecosystem that we are living in and are part of, and so appropriately we should be looking at an ecosystem basis.
Hello. Pardon the interruption. This is the conference operator. My name is Kevin. I apologize again for the interruption. I have been in contact with Coral Crown. She was having a bit of trouble accessing the meeting. Is it okay to transfer her in at this time?
Yeah, sure. Did she have the previous login information? Is that why?
Yeah, she gave me 2 different passcodes, and the most recent one she had brought up the account, so that's how I got the information.
Okay, I'm the host of the meeting. We had some issues with our audio provider this morning, so
Okay.
yeah, sure. I don't know how you're beaming yourself in. This is very Star Trek, but sure, the more the merrier.
Okay, sure, no problem. I'll go ahead and transfer them at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. Hello,
Well,
Coral,
yes.
you are now connected into the meeting, okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Welcome. I don't know how you got here, but you're certainly welcome. David has just started his presentation. We did have some technical issues this morning, so I'm glad you were able to join us. So yeah, sit back, relax, and David, I apologize for the interruption. You can keep going.
No problem. Basically, I mean, as I mentioned, the topic is very relevant, governance, because that's really the linchpin of getting things done. And the 2 questions that are raised immediately is governance for what and governance of what. Now, the of what you've answered because you're taking a watershed approach, that is an ecosystem-based approach. And the for what is really one of the focuses of the discussion today. And as your preliminary program suggests, many of the presenters will be talking about health of ecosystems, health of watersheds, and that is also near and dear to my interest. As Laura mentioned, for the past 4 decades or more, I have been working on approaches to this very question of how you understand the health of ecosystems. When I began that work some time ago, the issue of health was considered to be more a purview appropriate for humans, and bringing it up to the ecosystem level raised some interesting questions. Many people thought we were bringing up the old red herring of ecosystems as organisms, which is of course not the case. Ecosystems are complex and operate on very different principles than organisms, but nevertheless, as we well know, those of us who are interested in water or any other ecosystem in the world, there are issues with maintaining the full functions and the full vitality of these systems. So health is a very appropriate general descriptor. Laura, how do I get the slides up? Oh, I see they're here already. Okay, perfect. My presentation today will really cover some issues about ecosystem approaches or watershed approaches to healthy ecosystems. And it might surprise some of you to know that that something like 30 years ago, Canada was in a leading position in these types of conversations. We had developed some of the major conceptual models for approaching ecosystem health, and I'm not able to sort of sync my slides here. Oh, I see, here it goes. All right.
Do you need me to advance your
Oh,
slides for you?
got it. Okay. And as I said, about 3 decades ago, Canada was one of the world leaders, actually, in the whole aspect of developing an approach to this complex issue of the health of ecosystems. And in fact, the State of the Environment report was published in 1986, and prior to that, I had the privilege of working with Statistics Canada to develop the statistical framework upon which this report is based. That is, the information gathering needed to really understand this complex issue of how human activities impact watersheds and ecosystems. We took, right at the outset, an ecosystem approach, and we looked at Canada in 2 formats. One was the ecozones of Canada, that is the various ecological regions, in contrast to any political regions, and the other was on a watershed basis. And we used both of these as the fundamentals for our State of the Environment report. In the early days, there were just 2 of us, really, that spearheaded the first State of the Environment report. And I think you can tell from this picture who's the madder of scientist of the bunch. Well, Canada, as I mentioned earlier, was quite proud of the fact that they were leading this development, and it's quite a contrast to today. And so one of the issues we really want to discuss is what happened. How did Canada go from being one of the champions of an approach to the environment, concern about ecosystem health, a concern about how our environments were faring, to where we are now, which is not exactly in that same position. And that's one of the questions we want to address, particularly so when we talk about where we can go from here and what are the problems. Why has this situation changed so dramatically over the past 2 or 3 decades? In the first report on the state of the environment, of course, water was a concern, freshwater ecosystems, that is. And even back then, we were well aware that not all was going well for Canada. We are a country that's particularly blessed with with an abundance of fresh water. But as the minister summarized the State of the Environment report in a small pamphlet, the outlook even for Canada water was already recognized that there were some difficulties and some problems ahead, and that it was really a challenge at that time to hold the line on the then condition of Canadian waters. And it was already recognized at that time that some of our major watersheds were already in degraded condition. As many of you know now, things have deteriorated considerably since those days. And in fact, worldwide, some 50% of the major watersheds are considered to be in degraded condition. Well, it's easy to to talk about health in a general way, but really there is a considerable amount of thought has gone into what really constitutes ecosystem health. How do you know when you have it? What are healthy watersheds and healthy ecosystems in general? And what are we talking about beyond the metaphor of ecosystem health? It's so easy nowadays to use metaphors, sustainable development, healthy ecosystems, as buzzwords with very little content. The real issue is to understand the complex dynamics and what really constitutes health. That's the issue that I've been focusing on ever since which motivated the State of the Environment report. What do you really look at to know if you have healthy ecosystems or healthy watersheds? There are a number of major types of information that one would need to assess. And first of all, whether or not ecosystems display any of the many known signs of degradation. So the absence of what we call the ecosystem distress syndrome, which you would recognize in terms of Are the ecosystems contaminated? That's a very old theme. But also, what kinds of biota are able to survive in the ecosystem? Is it mostly endemic species, or is it mostly invasive species which are not native to these ecosystems? And also, of course, it's important to understand the nutrient flows through the ecosystem. Are we talking about excess or the loss of nutrients? Another key indicator. Others have to do with the species composition in terms of large biotic forms surviving or small. All of these are part of what goes into knowing whether or not ecosystems are in distress. In more general terms, flipping the coin there, looking at health, we want to know how are ecosystems organized, that is, what is the structure of their biotic and abiotic nature, how ecosystems are able to maintain their organization and maintain their productivity, and whether or not ecosystems bounce back from ordinary perturbations or pressures from human activities. Well, these questions are ongoing, but there's been a lot of work on these various areas, and I think that but once you have an understanding of what health might mean, the next question is, how do you evaluate the health? And here one is really right into the realm of indicators. And indicators are very trendy these days, but it's a very tricky business. Too often, indicators are pulled out of the hat without any real coherent framework for developing them or identifying what is really important. And it's very clear that indicators need to be science-based and knowledge-based. And here we're talking not only about formal knowledge or science as we develop it in universities, but also traditional knowledge and other kinds of knowledge that are based on systematic observations. And for that purpose, early on at Statistics Canada, we developed what has widely become known as the Pressure State Response System, or in some forms, the Driver's Pressure State Impact Response System. This was developed early on published in 1979, but I was recruited to Statistics Canada specifically to develop a statistical system of this nature. And it occurred to me then that obviously there are three major elements in such a system. First, the pressures from human activities, all sorts of pressures. At that time, people were mostly concerned with contaminants and also excessive nutrients in the Great Lakes, nutrients being a kind of contaminant in that situation. But we recognize that there are many other influences on ecosystems and human activities exert. Certainly land use changes, that is physical transformation of the land, which impacts both the terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. We recognize also the critical role of invasive species. We recognize that over-harvesting certainly as a major transformational source, and we began to recognize that climatic conditions were also entering into the suite of pressures on ecosystems. As to the state and condition, then you get into the whole question of what are degraded ecosystems and what are the signs of ecosystem health. And finally, and importantly for this discussion, we certainly want to focus on what, if any, are the responses of society at all levels, from legislation and regulations at the national level to community-driven actions in response to changing conditions. Well, we have come in the international community, at least, if not so much in Canada these days, a long way from the situation in the 80s, from the late 70s and 80s. Many of the assessments now have picked up on not only the concept of ecosystem health, but thoughtful indicators and measurements of ecosystem health of major ecosystems. One of the best examples, although it relates to a marine ecosystem, it's equally applicable to watersheds. And in fact, the main drivers of changes in this particular ecosystem are what go back to what's happening in the watersheds. And the Helsinki Commission, in reviewing the state of the Baltic, picked up on the two key frameworks that I mentioned. One is the pressure state response system, and the other is the concept of health and the indicators of health. As some of you may know, the Baltic is in a very sad situation, much as the Great Lakes, much as many of the watersheds in Canada. It suffers from an excess of nutrients, which fuel algal blooms, and in fact, the Baltic is known as having the largest dead zone in the world, something like covering 60 to 70,000 square kilometers. That is areas of the bottom waters which support very little life because they are oxygen depleted, largely oxygen depleted. In the State of the Baltic report, given our capabilities now for technology, it was possible to really document on an aerial basis the conditions with respect to a number of the key indicators. So here are a few of those situations, and eutrophication, hazardous substances. The red indicates very poor conditions, the yellow indicates not good conditions, and only the green signifies relatively healthy waters. So you can see that this is dominated largely by the red zones, and when it comes to biodiversity, another key indicator of health, you can see how depleted the Baltic Sea is today relative to its state before these human pressures became intense. Almost the whole central Baltic and the eastern Baltic is very impoverished with respect to biodiversity. The overall health status of the Baltic Sea is probably the most interesting. Bringing together all kinds of disparate information, it was possible with the modern informatics to develop a composite index of health of the Baltic Sea. And here you can see very clearly that it's in poor condition, which certainly reflects what everybody knows who lives along the Baltic coast. Well, this kind of approach was also in vogue in Canada way back in the early 1990s. The Freshwater Institute in Vancouver was looking at the health of the Fraser, and already at that time recognizing that it was in poor condition and that there were many signs of distress in that major river system, as we well know today, with disappointing salmon returns and all kinds of issues of contaminated waters. And going back to the early days of the Great Lakes, you can see from this diagram of cumulative stress, 2010, on the Great Lakes, that Lake Ontario is in very poor shape. So is Lake Erie, and so is Lake Michigan. To some extent, Lake Huron. Only the largest of the lakes, Lake Superior, is relatively, at this point in time, free of most kinds of major pressures from human activity. If you look at the Great Lakes as a whole, from way back in the 1840s to today, and take one of the key indicators, that is alien species, you can see a constant increase in the numbers of alien species, which mean conversely that the Great Lakes has continued to deteriorate. And it's important here to notice that this is going on despite decades and decades of intense interest in the health of the Great Lakes and much research and considerable concern by the communities. And this poses a real question: why has the situation not turned around? And one of the understandings that we have gotten from the study of ecosystem health is that when large-scale ecosystems go beyond a certain tipping point, it's virtually impossible to restore them to a healthy condition. There's no magic wand that can be waved in most cases to bring ecosystems back, even though in many of the discussions of international discussions on major ecosystems that have been almost entirely obliterated, like the Aral Sea or like the Mesopotamian marshlands, there are dreamers who think that by some magic all of this can be, what has been done can be undone. But we understand from restoration ecology that this is virtually impossible in many cases. So the real question is, although many ecosystems have gone beyond tipping points, we don't have to send many more in that same direction by continuing the kinds of pressures that are on those ecosystems. Another element of ecosystem health that has been researched in more recent times is what is the connection to human health and well-being. And here, obviously, we've long been, ever since Rachel Carson's book on Silent Spring, been concerned with contaminants, and even well before that, actually. But there are many other issues that relate to human health, the adequacy of potable water, the access to nutritional foods, and many other aspects, the pathogens which are, in fact, flourish in degraded ecosystems, human pathogens and animal and plant pathogens and so on. So there are quite a few issues that are concerning human health as part of the ecosystem and whose fortunes depend on the health of ecosystems. Those of you in the water management field certainly just know and have seen diagrams of this nature that although we're blessed with abundant overall supplies of water and in Northern Europe and North America, this is not the case across the world, and it's not the case all the time. In fact, as we speak, California is declaring a state of emergency because they are finding themselves water short, and they are implementing measures to correct this, attempt to correct this immediate crisis. We also know that our food supply is very much dependent on water. Growing food is dependent on water, whether from precipitation or from irrigation. And as the population has exploded around the world, the amount of acreage for growing crops per capita is continually diminished. But that's not even the whole story, because water is increasingly short. Many of the world's major rivers no longer reach the sea. It's a double whammo, really. You have a decreasing land use per person and decreasing water availability to manage to grow crops. So we are really coming very close to a global crisis in water, food, and human well-being. In fact, the end point of a crisis like this is the alarming numbers of environmental refugees that are already on the move, having been living in places that no longer support life, no longer support human life, and in many cases life of any kind, as dry lands turn to deserts, as rivers dry up, and so on. And it's estimated that by 2020, some 50 million, nearly twice the population of Canada, refugees will be on the move as a result of environmental causes, largely. And this number is outpacing political refugees by a large margin. Well, what can managers do to address this situation? How can we turn the corner on this and prevent a lot more difficulties down the road? And the first thing, of course, is to focus on an ecosystem approach, whether using a watershed basis or an ecozone geographic basis, to look at the ecosystem approach and to really understand deeply how these ecosystems function and what makes for healthy watersheds and healthy ecosystems. That's certainly a starting point. Having a little bit of difficulty there. Having difficulty changing the slide here. Let's see if we can get. Just a minute.
I can advance it if you want, David.
Okay. I have something in front of my screen here that's not. That's.
Just tell me when you want them changed.
All right, just a second. Well, you're doing well, except. All right. Let's go back a few. Was that the very next slide? That's up there now? There we go. Okay. Well, 20 years ago, the scientific community certainly issued a stern warning to all of humankind that we're overpowering the world's ecosystems, that a tremendous change is required in stewardship. And in fact, Henry Kendall, who headed the Union of Concerned Scientists, a very distinguished physicist, Nobel Prize laureate, once told me directly, he was one of the guest speakers at the first international conference on ecosystem health and human health, held in Ottawa in 1994. He told me directly that it's not just a matter of knowledge, it's really a matter of warfare. What did he mean by that? What he meant is that there are all too many people who well know. It's not just a question of knowing what we're doing to the environment. There are all too many people who well know in positions of power, but who nevertheless are charging full force ahead to develop the economy for short-term gains at the expense of our longer-term future. And that's what and that is really the one of the key challenges of our time. Because what has happened over the last 30 or 40 years is that governments are really hooked on the fundamental goal of economic growth at all costs. And although we know that the only people that will really subscribe to that, as the distinguished economist Kenneth Boulding said, are people that are either mad or economists. Unfortunately, those are the very people that are in power today that really call the shots for many of the world's communities. And they simply refuse to accept that the longer-term horizon, by continuing these policies, is not very promising. I mean, finance ministers, and I can speak certainly for Canada and other countries that I'm familiar with, have, although first the framework of pressure state response was widely accepted and continues to be accepted as in academia and in certain policy circles, finance ministers began to be quite worried about this because they reasoned that if the problem is really the pressures that human activity is placing on the environment, and if this system suggests that those pressures need to be reduced, that is taken off, and if that suggests that economic progress will be stymied, it's a non-starter. So it's as simple as that. There's an ideology here, and there's an understanding among leaders of most countries in the world, with very few exceptions. Perhaps Bhutan, by focusing on human happiness, is one of those exceptions. And most countries in the world feel that their future is all about growing the economy and and letting the environment basically, economics is failing us in terms of the larger life support system upon which we depend. So I don't think the future as it is now is too promising, but Kenneth Boulding suggests two general laws of the universe. Obviously, everything that's happened is possible, but not everything that's possible has yet happened. And that really takes us to the positive side of the future. If we recognize what is going on, we certainly need to develop a major shift in governance and develop the support of people that recognizes that it's not a sacrifice but an absolute essential if we're to have a sustainable life, that we deal head-on with the question of the health of our watersheds and the health of our ecosystems and reduce those pressures and, where possible, focus as the most important societal goal, not economic growth, but the health of the ecosystems and watersheds that support life. Thank you. That ends the presentation.
Thank you, David. So at this point, I would invite all of you on the line, if you have questions, to start typing them in the chat box. I'm going to bring myself back on here. We'll just do a little bit of room configuration here. And I also have a number of PDF files that David has kindly provided additional reading. So David, if you wanted to just maybe give a 2-minute just what each of these files is, or maybe it's sort of self-evident once people download them. But if you click on these titles up here, I've just put it in the top right-hand corner of the room, you can download these PDFs and get further information.
Sure. The recent paper on ecological indicators that was in the Journal of Ecological Indicators, it has to do again with the Baltic Sea and the recognition that while policymakers have long focused on the state of the Baltic Sea, they've given much less attention to the pressures that are determining that state. So what we have argued for in that particular paper is that we have to go upstream. We have to go into the watersheds and look at those pressures, and particularly the agricultural practices which are one of the fundamental issues in resulting in the eutrophication of the Baltic, to address that, and to really look at how well have policymakers done in reducing those pressures. So rather than focusing on just on the state, it's that paper was really a plea to go into the pressures and indicators of pressures, so that is to really hold policymakers, decision makers accountable. Are they really dealing with the problem head on, or are they not? What has been the trends in those pressures and the quantitative trends in pressures? The paper 2010 is an interesting one because it was situated in Canada. This was an effort of Bruce Mitchell, and has had several issues of his of a book published by Oxford University Press on the question of the state of the Canadian environment and environmental policy. This particular paper was a review of Canadian ecosystems in terms of their health, addressing the situation that we've been talking about today, the demise of many of these ecosystems in Canada through continued and intensified pressures from human activities, and the need for a fundamental recognition of that and change in policy. The paper with my partner in life and work, Louisa Maffei, is an example of situations around the world where the health of not only ecosystems but cultural systems is in decline, and what is the situation is and what might be done about that. So, and the paper with Mikael Hilden, I guess, is perhaps, and I can't remember which one that is, it might be a more general description of the situation of indicators. Or now that I think of it, actually, this is the one with the Baltic Sea, and the earlier one when I talked about ecological indicators, a more general description of indicators, something like that.
Perfect. So a couple questions. Lena, I don't know what organization Lena is with, asking about how about access to the Fraser River watershed ecological indicators? Do you have any information on that?
Well, you know, that those studies were not done by myself. That was the Freshwater Institute, and I'm not sure exactly what their update is on it, but I imagine that these indicators and situations are available from the Institute or from other institutes or researchers that have worked on the Fraser. It's not an area that I have addressed myself.
Okay. And a question from Sheila Muxlow, who's with the Water Wealth Project, asking, are there any success stories that you can point to which are starting to bring us into a good direction?
Success stories are really a tough one in this area because of the reasons I discussed. That is, government, even though they know, as Henry Kendall suggested, that we are trashing our environments, they are so single-minded on growing the economy that the remedial actions that are taking place are too weak to counter the ever-increasing human pressures on ecosystems. So while many well-intentioned efforts and good efforts, which without them the situation will be much worse, are going on, the problem is the balance is decidedly in a negative direction. So take the Great Lakes, for example, and the data I showed you. There has been interest and billions of dollars poured into efforts to redeem ecosystem part of the Great Lakes, you know, various harbors and watersheds within the Great Lakes. like in Green Bay, Wisconsin, or in Hamilton Harbor. And they have restoring wetlands and all kinds of activities that could lead to a healthier situation, but on balance, they have been unable to turn the tide because of continued pressures of all kinds, and particularly land use changes along the shoreline of the Great Lakes, which has destroyed much of the Great Lakes habitat. So there are positive stories in the sense that in the Great Lakes, again, phosphorus use and in detergents have been banned. There are certain regulations that have been in a positive direction. I think overall we haven't really dug in to address this question in a serious way, and we haven't been able to get the legislation and the governance and hold governance to account.
All right, we have a couple of comments as well that I'll read out, and maybe you just have some additional perspectives to add, David. Sort of connected, John Finney has said, Baltic Sea, Fraser Basin, Great Lakes, Lake Winnipeg, similar stories all over the world. Data being gathered for the last 30 to 40 years is showing clearly the impacts. We're either not making the correct course corrections or we're not making them fast enough. And then Julie P. has said, so our environmental problems are at the core of them economic problems. The paradigm of unlimited growth is the primary antagonist to ecosystem health. It seems that integrating environmental restoration targets with the economic/cultural restoration is the key element to making effective course corrections for environmental health. So do you have any additional sort of thoughts on those comments?
Well, I think they're right on the mark, both of them. And the question is our government listening, for example? I mean, I don't think that there's any indication in British Columbia in recent actions taken by the government to charge ahead with major projects that would destroy aquatic ecosystems and other ecosystems within British Columbia. There's no evidence whatsoever that the federal government, with respect to the tar sands and other issues on environment in Canada, is listening at all to the arguments about the importance of restoring healthy ecosystems. And we see the Athabasca River as one of the major degradation areas because of this full speed ahead on the tar sands. I don't really see that governments are listening. They are, if anything, trying to dumb down the information that people get. They have systematically reduced the availability of information. State of environment reporting, which was so strong in the 80s from the first report and was mandated in Parliament to continue every 5 years, was shut down 10 years later. Why? Too much bad news. This was the government understood that that there'll be too much concern by continuing to report. So they've systematically reduced science, trivialized science, cut the science facilities out. So unfortunately, I don't see a lot of good news for Canada unless there's a real change of the mindset away from the preoccupation with economic growth to an occupation about what we need to survive as part of our life systems. And what kind of a future are we leaving for our children?
So in the chat box, there's a couple potentially useful resources. Lena earlier was asking about the Fraser Valley, and there's a link here. The Fraser Basin Council has produced a series of indicator reports, so you can see that link provided. And also, Lena is sharing a recent paper published in Nature, Time to Leave GDP Behind, and the link for that is there as well for those of you who are interested. A question from Kelly Bannister. David, can you elaborate on the ecocultural aspects, particularly those that may be relevant to the role of First Nations cultural knowledge, traditions, governance, that we might consider in the forum that's happening next week and some of our dialogue there?
Well, certainly, and I think people are very well aware, and particularly First Nations communities, about how off course we are with respect to the environment. I mean, their culture is heavily integrated. They don't. Their knowledge is so close to the land that it's intuitive that their practices are to respect the land if they're to have a future. So they are much more tuned in to the whole issue. And the problem is that just like ecosystems are in distress because of human activity, so is the integrity and the health of many of the First Nations cultures. They're oppressed, the economic situation and inequitable distributions of benefits from the economy, and by abuses of their land titles and rights. So First Nations are also very much in danger of losing their culture for the same reasons that they're in danger from losing their ecosystems. And the same kinds of pressures are impinging on both. And that paper that was done with Louisa Maffei really is a discussion of how you cannot separate the health of culture from the health of nature. And both are under siege from the dominant mindset of the world today, which is economic growth is first and foremost. The paper that you mentioned by Bob Costanza about leaving GDP behind is an important commentary on how, and one that economists are well aware of, that the gross national product or gross domestic product does not consider any of the social or environmental costs of producing it. And when you do consider that, that changes your whole perspective on what's really going on in the world. Economists have long known for many, many decades of the inadequacy of this type of accounting, but the fact that it could be done and then people could understand in some way that all the sum of all human activity is encapsulated in these measures of GDP or GNP, they've continued with that course as a major watch on the environment and a major measure of the success of our leaders. But it's a very inadequate measure. It's only one dimension, and it leaves out a lot of important aspects for life.
Thanks, David. It looks like a couple people are still typing in questions. We can just give them a minute to get those in. This might be a useful time to let you know POLIS has just released a report today that may be of interest to some of you on the line. Some of you may have actually already received it if you're delegates, because we gave you an advanced copy, but just talking about sort of the path forward, and particularly in BC. It's called A Blueprint for Watershed Governance in British Columbia. So looking at the opportunity with the new legislation coming, what might really on the ground that look like in terms of thinking in from more of a watershed perspective. So I'll just grab the web link and paste it in the chat box here for those of you who might be interested. And yeah, we'll just wait a couple minutes if a couple more questions come in. Okay, so question here, I'm not sure who from guest 4. In my work as senior planner to the Peel Watershed Planning Commission, we applied an ecosystem-based approach to development of that plan, which is rooted in the Yukon Umbrella Final Agreement. It may be key to focus on such collaborative First Nations public processes. Any thoughts? And there's also a link there if anybody's interested in that document.
Well, there are many initiatives of this sort, and they're all to the good. Am I still online?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. So I mean, these are encouraging that this activity continues, and I think, as I say, the POLIS upcoming seminar is also encouraging. I mean, we need really a larger movement of interest, and all of these efforts, all of these initiatives are to the positive. The question is, will they really reach the finance ministers and get the finance ministers to get off this kick of economic growth is the supreme measure of progress? Will they really affect change? And this is precisely what this where governance is such a key aspect. If you can't change governance, we can talk and talk while we watch the ecosystems degrade. That's what's happened in Canada and around the world over the last 3 decades. Globally and nationally and locally, our ecosystems are on a steep decline. And the more we can get initiatives of this type and more focus on it and more public support behind it, the better the chances are that we will have in changing the course that we're on.
I think Kelly is, she left a cliffhanger of a question here. I think she's typing in the rest. David, we might consider a follow-up paper to the, we'll wait for her to fill that in. So we've got about 5 more minutes on the clock, just so everybody in the room is aware. If you do have any final questions, now's the time to get them in the chat box. We might consider a follow-up paper to the Time to Leave the GDP Behind paper after the Ethnobiology Congress in Bhutan and learn more about their gross national happiness experiences focused on ecological measures. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that is certainly a positive suggestion. There are, many people are interested in and beginning to become interested in, measures of happiness, and it's a difficult area. We're at early stages there, probably equivalent to where we were 30 years ago about measures of ecosystem health. The question is how you define happiness, what kind of measures would really hold water, so to speak, in terms of happiness, whose happiness, and so on. But to the extent that one can really relate that in a well-justified way to, obviously, intuitively, happiness is extremely important in human well-being. So the question is, the devil's in the details. Really, what are the measures of happiness? How solid are they, and if they can be devised in a way that's convincing, it's all to the good. That's obviously a key goal of human existence, is to be satisfied. And really, this goes back, to some extent, to aspects of ecosystem health. So what is a healthy ecosystem is certainly one that people thrive in, that they have a livelihood, that meet their minimum needs, they get spiritual satisfaction from being part of that ecosystem, and they sustain the ecosystem that's sustaining them. And this is certainly the intuitive knowledge and understanding and practice of many First Nations peoples. So to get this more as a general societal understanding and a reconnecting with nature, I think, is really vitally important. And issues of happiness will probably, as they developed and indicated, will probably ultimately come very much to the point that happiness is extremely dependent on the health of our ecosystems and watersheds.
So a question coming in from Jack Menard. In a democracy, we should be able to replace the people responsible for trashing our planet, but so few vote, and most potential voters don't trust science anyway, and would just like to go to McDonald's without having to think about such things. So how do we educate people enough to vote for a major course change?
Well, I guess that one of the things that this is a question I've been long thinking about. Certainly, one of the important things is to bring the knowledge to people about what is happening, what's in it, what does that mean for them. And as we've been dumbing down the knowledge, people are getting much less of that information. So what they're facing with on their television is just the corporate spin, which really controls a lot of government policy about, consume more and everything is so hip and you can't live without this, without any discussion of what that means for the planet or what means that local ecosystems and what that means for survival. Now, so to the extent that we can turn the corner on that and really get people to understand the implications of this, not as an academic exercise, but as a real living life understanding, that if we continue to go in this direction, life is going to be increasingly harsh. More and more hordes of people will be joining the ranks of already the large number of environmental refugees, and that is not a promising prospect. We may already be seeing, for example, in the health field, the first generation in which the progress in public health is turning the corner and going to a negative direction. So what we have seen is trends in increasing longevity, increasing years of healthy life. We may now begin to see those growth statistics turning around because of the conditions of our ecosystems. So we really need to really turn the corner on this, understand the implications for life, and that some things are more important than material benefits. And above a certain minimum, we really have to change. There has to be if we're to avert a ecological and global catastrophe for humankind, we don't have any choices. It's kind of like the analogy I might say is if someone comes with the doctor with gangrene and they said the diagnosis is dire unless they lose one of their limbs, they may not like those choices, but losing a limb may be a lot better choice than losing a life. I think it's even better when the environmental situation, we have the choice to really live a life or not live a life. We don't have to lose limbs if we act prudently and act quickly and reverse through good governance the current trend to look at the economic indicators as the sole and most important indicators and start looking at the ecosystem health indicators and watershed health indicators as a far more important dimension that needs to be constant vigilance and constant action to address the decline and to stop the carnage, basically, of the global commons.
All right. We've got about 1 minute left, and I don't know if we're going to be able to get to every question in the chat box. David, are you available for an extra, say, 5 minutes so that we could address them? And also, folks on the line, and I understand if you need to go. Would that be a possibility, David?
Sure.
Okay. So following up on Kelly Bannister's question about the happiness index, another Kelly on the line brought up the point of, is measuring our happiness too anthropogenic? Should we be measuring a fish's happiness, for example? Just a thought.
I'm not sure I got that question totally. You want to repeat that?
Yeah, so this is following up on Kelly Bannister's question about the gross national happiness experiences. Another Kelly is just saying, is measuring our happiness making it too anthropogenic? Should we talk about measuring a fish's happiness, or probably other animals or plants or whatever else?
Yeah, well, I mean, and in fact, measures of the health of ecosystems and the health of watersheds do exactly that in some ways, because they do track population trends, and obviously when the population is growing and prospering, one could reasonably say that things are going well for those particular species. And for many species, that's not the case today. So certainly biological and cultural diversity is an important aspect there.
All right, and it looks like we have 2 more comments. I think I might cut it off after this. From Dana McDonald from Evergreen, BC, working on watershed education in Vancouver. We find that most people don't know what a watershed is or that we live, work, and play in them. I think it will take a lot of work to make this mainstream information. In the public school system, nonprofits, we work to teach people through hands-on restoration and water quality sampling in urban parks and streams, but those people need to make a choice to participate. Much of the problem, which Jack mentioned, lies with those who choose not to participate. So a comment there. I don't know if you, David, have any additional perspectives to add.
Well, certainly we're aware of this, and on Salt Spring Island, in fact, we're involved in, my partner Louisa Maffei and I have been involved for quite a few years in just that, gathering information that the public should be aware of and making them, and delivering that kind of information to them through articles in our local newspaper and through community meetings, and we are carrying on with that process to actually hopefully by the end of this year, make a small booklet available to people that are interested about the state of Salt Springs ecosystems and the kinds of actions they can take to enhance the health of those ecosystems and watersheds. So it is important to get the community involved, and I think education in schools, they already have an education program that gets kids out into the environment and talks about that, and they actually get to do some of the monitoring and measuring of environmental conditions. And I think that's also the good, and this happens in grade school. The question is, what happens as these kids become adults? Are they going to be seduced by the mass media campaigns that are really the antithesis of connecting with the environment, or are they going to remember those early lessons and really treasure the ecosystems and recognize they're part of it, and that the health of those ecosystems is their health? That's the issue, and that's the challenge. It's very important to get to young people when their minds are still open, but then there's the challenge of keeping them open.
So final comment coming from John Finney again, and he says, I think one of the problems is that the environment, water quality, etc., does not have its own voice. The environment does not yell at us at meetings, demand things, vote, or do all the other stuff that gets the attention of our politicians. So in itself, it's silent for now. At the end of the day, the environment will eventually be heard or die trying. We might not be around by then. Not too pessimistic, I hope.
Well, no, I think it's realistic. I mean, this is true. Long ago, a distinguished ecologist asked me, well, who speaks for the environment? We are getting more and more people speaking for the environment through NGOs and through various basin commissions like the Helsinki Commission or the Great Lakes Basin Commission or the IJC. But these voices are not being listened to by those in charge of governance. That's really the key thing. I think that there are speakers for the environment. The information is there, but the way people think about life, especially decision makers, they're too hooked on the economic model of growth, and they're too hooked on the measures of progress, all in economic terms and not the whole dimension of life terms.
All right. Well, with that, I think we will close the discussion period of the meeting. I want to thank you all for attending. I'm just going to do some rearranging of the house here again. Sorry. And I want to make you aware that this is part of our regular ongoing webinar series, which I mentioned at the beginning. I don't have an exact date for the next session, but if you are on this meeting, you'll get added to our mailing list. So definitely you'll get that update and invitation. And also we do record all of our webinars. So feel free, you can head over to our YouTube channel. The link is there if you want to watch any of the previous recordings on all manner of topics generally related to policy and governance issues. So thank you all for coming. David, do you have any final words, final sign-off?
No, I think I've spoken enough. Good luck with the upcoming conference. I think it's important. I think you're focusing on the right linchpin, governance. I think you've got the right approach and conceptual approach, focusing on ecosystems and watersheds. That is an ecosystem approach to the environment. And also a number of the sessions are focusing on health. So it's all in the right direction, and just the key is what kinds of legislation, what kinds of other incentives to change course can be brought up, not only from legislation and regulations, but how can you induce people to really take a different approach to life and the environment, and therefore put more pressure on the decision makers to also change course.
Fantastic. All right, everyone, have a wonderful rest of the week, and I know I will see and meet most of you on Monday, potentially even Sunday. So until then, take care.